Hello, my name is Lauren. I am very sorry to not be able to be there tonight, but I'm honored to be able to present my thesis in this format anyway. Tonight I'll be discussing my thesis, which was written at Leiden University on Criminalizing Refugees, a critical discourse analysis on the narratives of forced migration. So in my research, I wanted to look at the inflammatory discourse that's used by politicians of powerful nations around issues of forced migration generally and refugees specifically as the cornerstone of how the global north maintains the status quo of the historically exploitative relationship with the global south. So in 2012, laws were passed making it impossible for anyone arriving by boat to have legal claim to asylum in Australia. One could argue that a byproduct of these strict Australian policies did not actually keep anyone safe, but simply forced those displaced people to flee en masse towards European and Mediterranean countries, straining an already stressed region. Former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott's discourse is important to examine as it's emblematic of the overarching refugee narrative prevalent throughout much of the global north. Narratives such as Abbott's have contributed to the securitized way refugee issues are managed. In their more modern perception, refugee persons are often conflated with being illegal invaders or opportunistic economic migrants. To better understand how this view on forced migration has become so prevalent, it's important to understand the power of language and its effects on how people think and act. The narratives and policy discussions around who is a worthy migrant in Western politics broadly can be discerned as strategically crafted so that forced migration issues continue to be divorced from the larger geopolitical, historically asymmetric relationship between the global north and south. Refugee status as it's understood in the European American psyche were founded on the image of a courageous defector, eluding a specific restricted group of politically conscious freedom fighters, first against the Nazi regime and then against the Soviet Union. This narrative persisted until the 1980s and 90s, at which time it greatly shifted. Initially, refugee stories focused on white, male bodies depicted as heroic, determined to have personal identity and individual story. This particular assumption speaks to the prioritization of those new migrants who would help to maintain or even strengthen the Western order and hegemony. This has led to the narrative of what defines a refugee, which is pervasive in the 21st century. It's a victim who's poverty-stricken, fleeing violence and war from a failed state, ultimately a helpless and distinctive other. So through the covert rhetoric of particular governments, I sought to explore how the criminalization of an otherwise internationally recognized legal right to flee conflict and seek asylum in a safer country has allowed the otherwise inhumane treatment of people to become socially acceptable and even codified into Western laws and policies. My thesis argues that these motifs and mechanisms of civilization, conquest, and Christianity are not new nor unique. The narrative which perpetuates the hierarchy of Western hegemony over the global South is recycled rhetoric with roots in Orientalist discourse and imperialist relationships. The analysis presented seeks to challenge the pervasive imbalance in power that has allowed Western politicians to criminalize refugees simply through their discourse, also aiming to challenge whiteness or the Anglo-Christian identity or positionality in academia and politics more broadly. The two specific speeches were chosen on my behalf for a few reasons. Together they illustrate a cross-section of typical international and domestic discourse put forward by many anti-immigration politicians during the 2015 refugee situation. Abbott typifies a specific conservative character in politics. Also, both speeches represent moments in time which attracted harsh media attention for their brazenness. In London, Abbott sought to make direct policy recommendations to European leaders while contributing to the growing Fortress Europe attitude. In my research, I draw greatly upon Lily Ling, who explains the hierarchy of progress in asserting Western prosperity as paralleled throughout history in other contexts. It's even blatantly synonymous with the imperial Western self versus the evil Oriental other narrative. In nations such as Australia, whose laws and constitution enshrines religious freedom and is ultimately a secular state, the invocation of Christian values as the basis for its stable society is problematic for a variety of both obvious and complex reasons. Asserting religion into the debate on how to manage refugee situations is arguably the most visceral and emotionally manipulative of all. It relies on provoking deeply embedded historical dichotomies of us versus them into the modern day political arena where would otherwise not be relevant. The thesis argues that the how of the ways in which Englishness, positioned as the oppressive global north, functions has been carried out effectively and covertly through carefully crafted political discourse. This discourse is first put forward by politicians, then reproduced through social norms and values, resulting in what can be understood in this case as the criminalization of refugee persons. The projection of the white sense of self, noted by social and cultural anthropologist Gloria Becker, arguably comes from the privilege of the global north being able to tell their own story rather than is often the case in the global south, which is that someone else speaks for you. This is a pervasive issue in IR theorizing, and the issue of who speaks for whom should be challenged often and critically. In examining what representation of the global south means, we can see that the ability to craft another's narrative is a remarkably effective tool for reinforcing hegemonic power and sustaining this centuries-long project of imperialist domination. Inflammatory political rhetoric has morphed the foci of debates in global politics about responsibility, international legal norms and frameworks, and capacities or resources to protect refugees into rather one about seemingly incompatible or exclusive dichotomies of identity, culture, religion between the global north and south.